Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. We're going to be tackling a big idea today, something that really shapes how we see the world, decolonizing our minds.
It's a really powerful concept.
Yeah, and it's about looking at those hidden biases we might have, especially when it comes to history and culture. Like, where did those ideas come from?
It's like someone just handed us these lenses and said, here, look at the world this way.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're exploring an essay called Pasted Text, which is all about one person's very personal journey of decolonization. What does that even mean, right?
And it's interesting, the author starts with this really relatable childhood story. I think a lot of us have had similar experiences.
Oh yeah, tell me more.
So the author's grandfather used to tell them stories about their ancestors being connected to the Indus Valley civilization.
Wow, that ancient civilization, right? With the incredible cities and everything.
Exactly. And the author was so excited to share this in school, but their teacher kind of shut them down.
Oh no, what
The
happened?
teacher favored the Aryan Invasion Theory instead, the idea that the Aryans came from outside and kind of shaped Indian civilization.
Right, right. So even as a kid, the author's already encountering these conflicting narratives about their own history. That's got to stick with you.
It does, and it becomes this recurring theme. Like in chemistry class, they learned about John Dalton and his atomic theory, but not so much about Canada.
Who's Canada?
Well, Canada was an Indian philosopher who proposed the concept of atoms centuries earlier, but he was just a footnote.
It's like, oh yeah, and by the way, someone in India already thought of that, but let's move on.
Exactly. Like it minimizes the contributions of non-Western cultures. And this keeps happening to the author. They talk about meeting this mentor, Professor Hari Ram Verma, who opened their eyes to different ways of looking at history.
It's like finding a guide when you didn't even know you were lost.
Yes. And then they study at Jamia Millia Islamia.
Which is,
Oh, it's a historically Muslim university in India. And there, they really grapple with the complexities of tolerance and identity, especially in a post-colonial context.
so each experience is kind of chipping away at those old assumptions, pushing the author to question what they thought they knew.
Exactly. And this journey of questioning leads them to a really pivotal moment, reading the Bhagavata Purana for the first time at 24.
Okay, for those of us who aren't familiar, could you give us a little background on that? What is the Bhagavata Purana?
Sure, it's one of the most important Hindu scriptures, a really vast text that explores spirituality, cosmology, philosophy. And for the author, reading it was like connecting with this whole rich tradition that they'd been kind of cut off from.
I see. It's like discovering a whole new dimension to your own culture.
Exactly. And it ignited this desire to learn even more. They even talk about how living in Canada, surrounded by a different culture, made them even more aware of their Indian and Hindu identity.
I've heard that from a lot of people who've lived abroad. Sometimes you need that distance to really appreciate where you come from.
Right. They actually share this funny anecdote about their Canadian peers being totally baffled by the concept of reincarnation. Like, it just highlighted these ingrained cultural assumptions that we don't even realize we have.
It's like suddenly seeing your own culture through someone else's eyes.
Yes. And this awareness, this willingness to question, is what really sets the author on the path of decolonization. For example, they wrote a paper arguing that Buddha should actually be considered a Hindu
Oh, wow. Really? Why'd they say that?
because of the deep connections between Buddhism and earlier Hindu traditions.
Interesting. What happened?
They got a failing grade. The professor wasn't having it.
Wow. So even in academia, there's resistance to challenging the established narrative.
And that experience, getting a failing grade just for presenting a different perspective, it really shows how deeply ingrained these colonial ideas can be.
It's like we inherit these mental maps and we don't even realize they were drawn by someone else with their own agendas.
Exactly. And the author identifies 3 essential truths, kind of like pathways, to dismantle these biases and see Indian history on its own terms.
Okay, I'm ready for these truths. Hit me with number 1.
The first truth is this: the Aryan Invasion Theory. Yeah, it's false.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying the Aryans didn't migrate to India at all?
It's not that simple. The author's not denying migrations happened, but the idea that this Aryan race invaded and shaped Indian civilization, that's where things get messy.
Okay, so what's wrong with that theory? We've all heard it before.
Well, for one thing, it came about at a time when Europeans were just starting to uncover the ruins of the Indus Valley civilization.
Right, with the amazing cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Those advanced cities, it's incredible.
Exactly. And these discoveries challenge the whole idea of Europe being the center of the world, the sole source of civilization.
Because here was evidence of a sophisticated civilization that predated ancient Greece and Rome. It changes everything.
Right. And the Aryan Invasion Theory, it kind of provided a way to explain away that sophistication. Like, oh, these advanced ideas, they must have come from outside, from a superior Aryan race. It's very convenient.
So it's not just about historical accuracy, it's about power dynamics. Who gets to be at the center of the story?
Exactly. And this narrative had huge consequences in India. It created this artificial divide between Aryan and Dravidian, with Aryans as the bringers of civilization.
Which is so dangerous, right? Because then you're saying one group is inherently more civilized than the other.
Exactly. And the author makes this really interesting point. No other nation seems to obsess over this invader versus indigenous narrative like India does.
That's a good point. Like, England had the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Normans.
Yeah.
They were invaded multiple times.
Right. But do you see modern England divided along those lines? Not really.
So it highlights how the Aryan Invasion Theory, even if it had some truth to it, was used in a very particular way in India.
Yes, it was weaponized. And the author brings up some fascinating archaeological evidence to back this up.
Like what?
Well, they mention Vedic fire altars found in India dating back to 3500 BC. That's way before the supposed Aryan invasion.
So the Vedic culture was already there.
It seems that way. It's like the author asks, if the Aryans didn't bring these ideas, then what did they bring? The answer, they say, is nothing.
Wow, okay, so that's the first truth. What about the second?
The second truth is a tough one. It's about the impact of Islamic rule in India. And we have to be careful here because it's a very sensitive topic.
Of course. We're not shying away from difficult conversations, but we also want to be respectful of everyone's experiences and perspectives.
Absolutely. And the author's not trying to point fingers or anything. It's more about encouraging an honest look at history, even when it's uncomfortable. They start by talking about Shashi Tharoor's speech about the British debt to India.
Right, the one where he argues that Britain owes India a moral debt for centuries of exploitation. It's a powerful speech.
Yes. And the author's saying there's a similar lack of acknowledgement when it comes to Islamic rule. They bring up this statistic. Over 40,000 Hindu temples were destroyed during India's interactions with Islam.
40,000.
Yes.
That's just, I don't even know what to say to that. What kind of impact does that have on a culture?
A huge impact. The author calls it a civilizational trauma. It's not just about physical buildings. It's about knowledge, tradition, cultural memory, all being destroyed.
It's like erasing a people's story.
Yes. And the author talks about the psychological impact, seeing your sacred spaces destroyed, your people persecuted. That kind of trauma echoes through generations.
It becomes a wound that never really heals.
Right. And the author's not saying this to dwell on the past, but to understand how it still shapes India today, how it fuels tensions, how it impacts identity.
So it's about acknowledging that this happened, that it had real consequences, and that those consequences are still being felt today.
Exactly. And they make an interesting point about how this challenges the idea that Brahmanas, the priestly caste, were the primary oppressors in pre-colonial India.
Right, because there's this whole narrative about the caste system being this oppressive force.
And while the caste system had its problems, the author argues that Brahmanas were often the main targets of persecution during Islamic conquest. They were the keepers of knowledge, the performers of rituals.
So by targeting them, you're targeting the very heart of a culture.
Exactly. And the author says this needs to be acknowledged, not to point fingers, but to start a conversation about healing and reconciliation.
It's about having an honest conversation about the past, no matter how difficult it might be.
Yes. And they point to the Ram Mandir issue as an example. The emotional and spiritual significance of reclaiming that site, which was, according to historical evidence, destroyed.
It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and facts. It's about people, their beliefs, their experiences.
Exactly. And with that, we come to the third and final truth. This one might be the most mind-bending of all.
Okay, lay it on me.
The author uses this analogy of a nudist civilization encountering a clothed civilization.
A nudist civilization. All right, now you've got my attention. Tell me more. So we've got this nudist civilization, this culture with a totally different way of seeing the world. But how do we even begin to understand those differences? It feels like we're missing the language for it.
That's exactly the point the author's making. Even the language we use is shaped by colonial biases. We try to talk about ancient India in terms of religion or nation state, but those categories don't really fit.
Like trying to describe a three-dimensional object with only two-dimensional terms.
Right. So the author says, let's look at the language ancient Indians used to describe themselves. That's where all those Sanskrit terms come in: Rashtra, Desa, Varsha, Vansha, each with its own subtle meanings.
And those words tell us more about how they actually organize themselves.
Exactly. They had complex systems of governance, culture, thought it wasn't just random groups of people. The author calls India the last library of Alexandria, a living repository of that ancient wisdom.
That's powerful. Like we've been looking at the wrong map this whole time.
And missing all the treasures along the way.
So how do we start seeing those treasures? How do we shift our perspective to really appreciate Indian civilization?
The author says one way is to engage with the philosophical and spiritual traditions that came from this nudist way of being. Like Western ideas of theism and atheism, they don't really apply to traditions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism.
Right, I've heard that before, but I struggle with it. It's like you either believe in God or you don't, right?
That's our categories talking. The author's saying these traditions offer a different way of approaching the big questions. They call it transtheism?
Transtheism. So not denying a divine reality, but going beyond our limited ways of understanding it.
Exactly. It's about recognizing there are multiple valid paths to truth, multiple ways of experiencing the divine.
It's like instead of arguing about what's at the end of the tunnel, these traditions are saying maybe it's something we haven't even imagined yet.
Yes, and that's really what the author wants. A more expansive way of seeing the world, embracing complexity and nuance,
Recognizing that our current ways of understanding things might be incomplete.
and being open to new information, different perspectives.
Because, like the author says, sometimes it's the generations that grew up after independence who are the most colonized.
Because colonialism isn't just physical, it's about shaping minds.
And those subtle forms can be the hardest to shake.
Definitely. It's an ongoing process.
It is. So to our listeners, we leave you with this. What will your journey of decolonization look like? What will you discover when you start questioning those old maps? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.